London, June 1941. A man walks into a department store on Oxford Street and asks for a new pair of socks. He is unremarkable in almost every way. Medium height, neatly dressed, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who has rehearsed this moment. He places his money on the counter. The shop assistant smiles and asks, as she has asked every customer for the past 11 months, for his clothing coupon. The man hesitates. It is barely a fraction of a second, barely anything at all. But it is enough. The clothing coupon he produces is wrong. Not forged, not stolen, genuinely issued by the British government, but wrong in a way that no legitimate British resident could possibly get wrong, because no legitimate British resident would ever make the mistake he has just made. He has presented a coupon for the correct number of points. He knows the rationing system. He has done his research. What he has not done, because he could not have known to do it, is account for a change in the coupon book that was announced, distributed, and absorbed into the daily lives of ordinary British people over the preceding few weeks. A change so mundane, so bureaucratically tedious, that no German intelligence briefing had thought to mention it. Within the hour, the man is in custody. He is not the first. He will not be the last. And the instrument of his undoing is not a sophisticated cipher machine, not a double agent, not a piece of aerial reconnaissance. It is a clothing ration book, arguably the dullest weapon ever deployed in the history of espionage. To understand why clothing coupons became such a devastatingly effective trap, you have to understand the world Britain found itself in by the summer of 1940. The fall of France in June of that year had stripped the country of its principal continental ally and left it facing the genuine prospect of invasion. The evacuation at Dunkirk had saved the men of the British Expeditionary Force but had abandoned most of their equipment on the beaches. The Royal Air Force was fighting for survival in the skies above southern England, and on the ground, the threat of German infiltration was treated with a seriousness that bordered on collective obsession. The fear was not irrational. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had spent the preceding years building networks across Europe. Britain knew from its own code-breaking efforts, the work being done at Bletchley Park under conditions of extraordinary secrecy, that the Germans were attempting to insert agents into the country. What British intelligence also knew, though they could not yet be certain of the full picture, was that those efforts were going rather badly for the Germans. The agents being sent were being caught and caught quickly. The reasons varied: poor cover stories, unfamiliarity with British idiom, suspicious behavior at railway stations. But increasingly, there was a more systemic reason. The agents were being tripped up by the texture of everyday British life, and nothing was more textured, more granular, more constantly shifting than the rationing system. Britain had introduced food rationing in January 1940, following the model established during the First World War. Clothing rationing came into force on the 1st of June 1941, introduced by the Board of Trade under the direction of Oliver Lyttelton, who had the thankless task of informing the British public that buying a new suit now required surrendering 66 coupons from an annual allocation of 66. In other words, one suit consumed your entire year's entitlement. A pair of men's shoes cost 7 coupons. A woolen dress cost 11. A pair of stockings cost 2. A figure that would cause significant anguish among women throughout the war years. The administrative machinery behind clothing rationing was extraordinary in its detail. Every resident of Britain was issued a ration book, and those books were periodically updated, revised, and reissued as the government adjusted the system to reflect changing supply conditions, manufacturing capacity, and political reality. Coupons were sometimes replaced by new coupons with different markings. Validity periods changed. Certain pages were declared invalid at short notice, announced through local newspapers and BBC broadcasts that reached essentially every household in the country. For anyone actually living in Britain, these changes were simply a part of the background noise of wartime life. Irritating, occasionally confusing, but absorbed almost unconsciously through daily exposure. For a German agent trained in Hamburg or Paris, attempting to reconstruct this system from briefing, documents, and outdated intelligence reports, the task was essentially impossible. The Abwehr could obtain copies of British ration books through neutral countries, through diplomatic contacts, through captured documents. What they could not obtain was the lived experience of queuing in a British shop, reading the notices pinned behind the counter, listening to the wireless announcement that the buff-coloured coupons in Section 3 of the current book were no longer valid from the first of the month. That knowledge lived in the muscles and habits of ordinary people, not in any document that could be photographed and transmitted to Berlin. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps stories like this one coming. The practical mechanics of how this trap worked were almost comically simple. A German agent arriving in Britain by parachute, by small boat on a dark stretch of coastline, or occasionally through more elaborate means, would be carrying documentation that his handlers believed to be current and accurate. His ration book would be genuine, or a high-quality forgery. But it would reflect the state of British rationing as understood by German intelligence at the time of his briefing. If that briefing was even a few weeks out of date, the book might be wrong in small but telling ways. A coupon from the wrong issue period, a page that had been declared invalid and should have been cut out or stamped, a book that was the right color but the wrong size, following a revision that German intelligence had not yet registered. British shopkeepers who handled these books dozens of times every day and knew them with the intimacy of professionals noticed. Shop assistants who had been quietly asked by the Ministry of Food to be alert to irregularities reported their suspicions to the police or to local Home Guard units. In some cases, agents were arrested at the point of sale. In others, they were allowed to leave the shop while surveillance was arranged, their movements tracked until a more complete picture of their contacts and objectives could be established. The exact number of agents compromised in this way is difficult to establish with precision. British intelligence records from this period remain partially classified, and the official histories necessarily elide certain operational details to protect methods and sources that were still considered sensitive decades after the war ended. What can be said with confidence is that the double-cross system, the extraordinary MI5 operation run by the 20 Committee, so named because 20 in Roman numerals is 20, a double cross, captured virtually every German agent sent to Britain during the war years. By the assessment of J.C. Mustermann, who chaired the 20 Committee and later wrote its history, not a single German agent operated successfully in Britain for any sustained period during the Second World War. The clothing coupon was one thread in a much larger net, but it was a thread the Germans never managed to cut. The German response to their repeated failures was instructive. The Abwehr attempted to improve the quality of their documentation, investing in better forgeries and more current intelligence about British rationing changes. They trained their agents more thoroughly in the details of British daily life, running them through simulated shopping scenarios and testing their knowledge of current coupon values. Some of this training was effective. By 1943, agents arriving in Britain were generally better prepared than those who had come in 1940 and 1941. But the fundamental problem remained. Any gap between training and deployment was a gap in which British regulations might change, and that gap could never be fully closed. The American Office of Strategic Services, observing British methods with considerable admiration, incorporated similar thinking into their own agent training programs, recognizing that the most dangerous vulnerabilities were not in the grand machinery of espionage, the ciphers, the dead drops, the invisible ink, but in the small domestic rituals that real people performed without thinking, knowing how to buy a railway ticket, knowing which side of the pavement to walk on, knowing that in a British pub, you do not ask for a beer, you ask for a pint or a half or a particular variety, because nobody in Britain simply asks for a beer any more than an American would simply ask for a drink. The Soviets, it should be noted, were considerably more successful at inserting long-term agents into Britain during this period, partly because they were recruiting from within, building networks of sympathizers who already lived authentic British lives, rather than parachuting in outsiders. The atom spy ring, the Cambridge Five, the various industrial and diplomatic sources that passed information to Moscow throughout the 1940s. None of them were tripped up by a clothing coupon, because none of them needed to buy a fraudulent one. The legacy of the clothing coupon trap is not military in any conventional sense. No battle was won or lost because an agent was caught reaching for the wrong ration book. The strategic impact of the double-cross system as a whole, the feeding of false intelligence to German high command through turned agents, the misdirection of German forces before D-Day, the systematic undermining of the Abwehr's confidence in its own networks. That impact was considerable, and historians continue to debate precisely how much it shortened the war. But the clothing coupon, specifically, is a reminder that the infrastructure of ordinary life is itself a form of intelligence. A constantly updated, impossibly detailed record of how a society actually functions at a given moment, accessible to anyone who lives within it, and essentially impenetrable to anyone who does not. Original ration books from this period survive in considerable numbers. The Imperial War Museum in London holds extensive collections, as does the National Archives at Kew, where visitors can examine the actual documents, the buff and blue pages, the perforated coupons, the official stamps, that were simultaneously the administrative backbone of a nation at war and one of its most effective counterintelligence tools. They are modest objects, roughly 12 centimeters by 8, printed on paper that was itself subject to wartime economies. They feel slight in the hand. You would not look at one and think, weapon. But return to that Oxford Street department store in June 1941. Return to the moment of hesitation, the fraction of a second in which a man reaches for the wrong coupon, and a shop assistant's expression shifts almost imperceptibly. The entire edifice of German intelligence in Britain, the training programs, the wireless sets, the forged documents, the carefully constructed cover stories, could not survive contact with the lived reality of a society that knew its own ration books the way it knew its own handwriting. The spy had learned the rules. He had not lived the changes. And in a country where survival meant adapting, constantly and without complaint, to an endless stream of small bureaucratic adjustments, that distinction was everything. The Germans built magnificent instruments of war. They built tanks that outclassed almost everything arrayed against them in the early years of the conflict. They built submarines that came within a hair's breadth of strangling Britain's Atlantic supply lines. They built rockets that could not be intercepted by any technology then existing. What they could not build, what no intelligence service in the world has ever successfully built, was a machine for replicating the unconscious competence of ordinary daily life. The most sophisticated espionage network in history was undone in part by a booklet of perforated paper and the sharp eyes of a woman who sold socks for a living.